Oil prices today hit their highest level since November. Right now, Brent is trading at around $66.40 a barrel. You can see the numbers on the screen. WTI is at $55.97. Crude is getting a boost from OPEC-led supply cuts. The cartel agreed last year to cut output by 1.2 billion barrels per day to prevent oversupply. Also, keeping them high, supply hopes that the US-China trade war may soon end, and US sanctions on Venezuela. In the coming hours, President Trump is set to address the escalating crisis in Venezuela. President Trump is at his resort in Mar-a-Lago in Florida and heads today to Miami to make a speech on the subject. At a time of US aid to Venezuela is being blocked at the Colombian border, Joe Johns is with me at the White House. Colombian aid is being blocked. The president, obviously in a highly Hispanic or largely Hispanic Miami, speaking to an important constituency there. So what's he expected to say?
We're expecting him to make quite a few points, frankly, Richard. We've gotten some information from the press secretary, Sarah Sanders, who says, among other things, the president is going to express support for Juan Guaido, the interim president who's been recognized by the White House. And we're also expecting to hear a bit about Cuba. Apparently, the White House has a lot of concerns about Venezuela becoming a puppet, if you will, of Cuba. We also expect to hear from the president a warning, if you will, to military leaders in Venezuela, encouraging them to either get out of the way of democracy in Venezuela or essentially lose all they have. And probably the last thing is a warning that the United States knows where they have assets hidden around the world and might be able to reach those if the military doesn't do what is the right thing in the view of the president, Richard.
As we'll see in a minute, the aid that's being sent is building up in Colombia. But what more can the administration do? Bearing in mind Maduro's threats, basically, of blood if the US does try and force any form of military action?
It's difficult to see just how far Washington is willing to go. The president has not really said whether he would use military force to try to overthrow Maduro. The president has essentially left that as an open question. Right now, the use of military personnel in the region is primarily to help deliver the humanitarian aid, Richard.
Joe Johns, there has been so much unsettling times at the White House, so much obviously with the Mueller inquiry continuing. What would you say is the current state of the White House?
Current state of the White House is watching Mueller very carefully and trying to get on with business as usual, though, as you know, it's very difficult. Every time there's another headline about what's happening with the Russia investigation, the White House has to turn to that quite naturally. So it's been chaotic since the very start, and I can tell you that really hasn't changed that much, Richard.
Joe Johns at the White House this morning, thank you. U.S. Republican Senator Marco Rubio says the aid that we were talking about there is going to get through to Venezuela. Now, the senator was on the border with Colombia over the weekend, meeting U.S. officials and meeting members of Venezuela's National Assembly. The Florida senator spoke to CNN's Ana Cabrera.
The aid is going to get through, and I think ultimately the question is whether it gets through in a way that he's cooperative with or in a way that he's not. But there's no way you're going to stand ultimately in the way of a people whose children are starving to death, whose families are dying in hospitals because of preventable diseases and they don't have the medicine for it. So obviously tactics are something I'm not going to publicly announce to allow the regime and their allies to make efforts to block it. But I would say this, imagine for a moment if you're a member of the National Guard or the Venezuelan military, your own family is hungry, your own family is starving, your own relatives are dying because they can't get dialysis or HIV medications, and you're going to follow an order to block that from reaching the people? I think the bigger threat comes from these criminal bands that he's empowered, these literally just street thugs that he's given guns to. They're the ones that present a greater danger. But I will say this to you, we know if there is violence next week and people are harmed here, we know who's responsible for it, and every single one of them will pay a price. they will face justice, and they will spend the rest of their lives worried about justice catching up to them.
President Trump has said nothing's off the table. Would you support any military intervention, and do you believe it will come to that?
Well, the only military intervention that's happening now in Venezuela is the Cuban government, the Cubans that are controlling everything that's happening, the security forces and everything else. The United States retains the right to utilize military force in its national security interest anywhere in the world. That's not just Venezuela, that's anywhere on the planet. But that's not what we're here to do today. There's no military aid here. This is food, this is high energy bars for starving children, this is rice, this is beans and lentils, this is sanitary kits. This is medicine. That's what we're here to do, and none of that has anything to do with military intervention. Right. Feeding people is not anything to do with the military, and in fact, it is a crime against humanity to deny food and medicine to unarmed and innocent civilians.
I understand that, and I agree with you on that, but would you support military intervention ultimately?
Well, it's not my decision to make. I ultimately will tell you I support defending the national interest and the national security of the United States anywhere in the world where that's being threatened. And ultimately I'll leave it at that, because that's not what we're focused on right now. I will say this, and I won't go any further than to say this to you. There are certain lines, and Maduro knows what they are, and if they are crossed, I am confident, based on everything I've heard from this administration and everything I know about this administration, that the consequences will be severe and they'll be swift. And he's aware of that. But again, our focus here has nothing to do with that. It has to do with food and medicine. That's what we're hoping will happen, and we're expecting to happen starting next week.
Isa Soares is in Caracas, where aid is badly needed to go across the border. She joins me now. So how does the aid get in to Venezuela? If the Maduro, you had Marco Rubio, how does it get to you or where you are?
Well, according to Juan Guaido, Richard, what he wants to create is what he calls a human chain of people who are not only in Venezuela but also across the border. He wants 1 million or so volunteers. He's been asking people to go online and sign up, and he wants them to create a human chain and to bring that aid across the border. People have been receiving, those volunteers have been receiving those emails, and they will find out closer to Saturday 23rd where exactly they're gathering and how exactly they are gathering. But I can tell you that just from here all the way to the border, you have about 10 or so checkpoints, and they're telling individuals to get out of the car, and they're checking what they have or what they're doing. So it's going to be extremely hard, and if it does happen, it's going to make their life extremely hard. But it's needed. It's really needed, Richard. 350,000 people are in dire need of help, as I found out when I visited a hospital in Cucuta.
For most of her young life, Frangeli has only known hunger. And now her body is feeling its impact. Frail, irritable and in pain, she's been unable to keep food down. But her little tummy, suffering from severe acute malnutrition in what was once the world's richest oil nation, just can't keep it in. She's one of thousands of Venezuelan children leaving home, with many being treated at this border city hospital in Cucuta. Several floors up on the maternity ward, I meet several women who too have seen scarcity for months on end.
Y allá que comías, what did you eat there?
Very little. Rations.
I go further down the hall, and on a floor where pain and life go hand in hand, I come face to face with tragedy.
She's telling me that her baby's dead. No heartbeat, nothing, no life, she's telling me. ¿Cuántos meses tienes? 29, 6 months, so basically 29 weeks. So her baby's died.
This is the toll of the humanitarian crisis Nicolas Maduro denies. But death and despair are not just contained within these hospital walls. I travel through old Cucuta and meet others desperate for help. 19-year-old Kleber Salazar recently arrived from Caracas. He made the journey simply for survival.
Si me quedaba en Venezuela, yo iba a morir. Yo sabía que yo me iba a morir. Incluso todos mis compañeros con VIH en Venezuela, nada más queda uno vivo. de 30.
He says he's HIV positive and desperately needed antiretroviral drugs unavailable back home. As he gets a checkup, the doctor at the NGO for which Kleber volunteers for tells me 9 of his HIV patients died in 2018, all Venezuelans. Kleber got out just in time, but getting here has come with sacrifice, and the wounds he carries are still fresh. I do my best to delicately ask him if he ever had to sell sex to survive.
Sí lo vendí, y lo vendí muchas veces. Y lo vendí no tan solo por medicinas, lo vendí por comida, lo vendí porque necesitaba muchas cosas.
The desperate situation there, Isa, any sign of things getting better?
Richard, it is heartbreaking to listen to these stories, and you hear on that side, I've had people stopping me on the shoulder and asking me, when is the aid, when can I get my hands on the aid? And on this side, people won't tell you on the street, Richard, but quietly, they'll tell you just how bad it is for them. So that is why 23rd is so important, to get that aid into Venezuela. Richard?